A financial crisis erupts, banks fail, currencies collapse, panic spreads on the streets, millions lose everything. Yet somehow in the shadows, a select few always seem to profit. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it isn't. It's history. Crash after crash, powerful hidden hands have turned chaos into opportunity. From Renaissance Florence to the Industrial Age, a handful of families amassed unimaginable wealth and influence, quietly steering the fate of nations. They were bankers behind kings, the Medici, the Fuggers, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and others. Dynasties that ruled not by the sword, but by the purse. How did they gain such power? And what did they do with it? This is the story of the dark elite of finance, financial dynasties that shaped our world from behind the scenes, through mystery, ambition, and covert control. The Medici, godfathers of banking. Florence, 15th century, a city of gilded churches and bustling markets. In this Renaissance cradle, one family would leverage banking into power. The House of Medici were merchants turned bankers. They weren't blue blood nobility, yet by 1434 they had become the de facto rulers of the Florentine Republic. How? By forging a lucrative partnership with the Catholic Church. The Medici Bank collected the Pope's taxes, the 10% tithe on everyone's earnings, under threat of excommunication. It was the most ingenious business arrangement of the age. The Pope himself was deep in debt to them. By 1434, half of the Medici Bank's profit came from its Rome branch serving the papacy. Everyone wanted an account at the Pope's bank. Their leverage was immense. When one cardinal owed a huge debt, a new bishop's appointment was delayed until the cardinal paid up. The Medici could stall the very church to collect their due. The Medici's rise wasn't just built on piety and ledgers. It was built on ruthless ambition. They bribed, schemed, and even resorted to violence to climb to the top. Rival families who stood in their way often ended up ruined or dead. The Medici mastered the art of networking and patronage, what they called amici degli amici, friends of friends. Everyone owed them favors, from merchants to monarchs. This invisible network made them untouchable. Their money fueled the Renaissance itself. The Medici funded famous artists and architects, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Brunelleschi, not just from love of art, but to cement their legacy and influence. Every church dome and masterpiece they paid for was a monument to Medici power. At their height, the Medici even produced 2 popes and married into the royal houses of Europe. A Medici princess, Catherine, became Queen of France. Bankers' sons now sat on thrones. Their power felt limitless. But no dynasty lasts forever. Late in the 15th century, cracks formed. The Medici Bank expanded into risky ventures and suffered huge losses from bad loans and political upheaval. In 1494, after France invaded Florence, the Medici Bank collapsed and the family was exiled. For a time, it seemed the Medici era was over. But their lesson had been learned by others, that money could buy power on a grand scale, even bend church and state. As the Medici influence waned in Italy, another banking titan was already rising in the north, ready to carry that torch. The Fuggers, masters of metals and empires. Augsburg, Germany, late 15th century. The Renaissance flows north. Here, Jakob Fugger, known as Fugger the Rich, is about to rewrite the rules of banking and become, arguably, the richest man who ever lived up to that time. The Fuggers started as humble weavers, but Jacob transformed the family business into a continental empire of finance and trade. By the early 1500s, he had secured a grip over Europe's copper and silver mines, effectively controlling the money supply, since coins were made of those metals. Kings and emperors came knocking on Fugger's door for loans. He largely financed the rise of the mighty Habsburg dynasty. In 1519, when the throne of the Holy Roman Empire was up for grabs, Jakob Fugger bankrolled the winning candidate.
The gold, take it all. There is plenty more where that came from.
That candidate was Charles V of Spain. Fugger raised 544,000 of the 852,000 gulden needed to bribe the electors and ensure Charles beat his rival, the King of France. In one masterstroke, a banker placed an emperor on the throne. The rewards were immense. Charles V granted Fugger control over royal mines and revenues in return. Spanish silver from the New World, German copper, the wealth of entire continents flowed into Fugger's coffers. He created a mining monopoly that was the industrial powerhouse of its time. Determined, Fugger didn't just seek profit, he sought to change the financial system itself. Medieval church law forbade usury, charging interest, limiting bankers. Fugger, needing interest on loans, pressured the Pope to relax those laws. He and other merchant dynasties succeeded in getting the church to amend the ban on interest, ushering in a new era of lending. There was a dark side to this alliance. Fugger also managed the sale of indulgences, essentially the church selling forgiveness for sin, because the proceeds were used to pay off loans and fund grand projects. This practice, infamously corrupt, provoked an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. Luther's outrage at indulgences helped ignite the Protestant Reformation. In a way, Fugger's financial schemes shook the foundations of Christianity. As Fugger's influence grew, so did public resentment. German pamphleteers denounced him for monopolizing markets and wielding more power than kings. Ulrich von Hutten and others railed against Fugger the Rich, seeing him as a symbol of greed devouring society. But even their criticisms were powerless to stop him. By the time Jakob Fugger died in 1525, he was a nobleman in his own right, granted the title count by the emperor, and one of the wealthiest individuals in history. He had no children. His nephews inherited his empire. But the stresses of an ever-expanding business and the volatility of lending to monarchs eventually caught up. In the decades after Jakob's death, the Fugger Bank's dominance receded. Yet, Fugger's legacy was profound. He pioneered the idea that bankers could be kingmakers, that financial capital could determine the course of empires. The world of the 1500s had seen bankers from Florence and Augsburg dominate entire economies. But a new age was dawning, and with it, a new dynasty, one that would operate on a truly international scale across the 1800s. The Rothschilds, lords of international finance. Early 19th century Europe, a world ravaged by the Napoleonic Wars and ripe for financial innovation. In this turbulent time, one family rose to unprecedented global influence, the Rothschilds. From the ghettos of Frankfurt, they built a banking empire that spanned the continent and beyond. Strategic Mayor Amschel's genius was turning family ties into a financial web. He dispatched his 5 sons to Europe's major capitals, Nathan to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples, and Amschel Jr. staying in Frankfurt. This created a network of Rothschild banks in an age when communication was as critical as capital. What set the Rothschilds apart was information. They built a private courier system, fast ships, swift riders, even carrier pigeons that outpaced governments. In an era before telegraphs, the Rothschilds could know news days or hours before anyone else. Legend has it that this information network gave the family its most famous coup, June 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. While Europe held its breath to see if Napoleon would be defeated, Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London already knew the outcome, a full day before the British government. According to lore, Nathan took full advantage. He appeared at the London Stock Exchange, expression grim. Believing he had inside knowledge that Britain lost, traders panicked when they saw Rothschild selling. Prices plunged in a selling frenzy. The moment they hit bottom, Nathan quietly bought everything he could. When the official news arrived that Wellington had won, the market soared, and Rothschild's holdings surged in value. This pump and dump tale has been debated. Some details are likely embellished by history, but the core truth is undeniable. The Rothschilds' speed and secrecy gave them an edge over even governments. They did, in fact, make enormous profits in the aftermath of Waterloo, and by the 1820s they controlled vast portions of European government debt. They had become, as one observer noted, the unofficial lender of last resort to Europe's monarchs. Throughout the 19th century, the Rothschild family bankrolled the infrastructure of Europe. They financed railroads spanning continents, canals like the pivotal Suez, and national loans that governments needed for war and peace alike. In 1875, when the British Prime Minister needed funds immediately to buy the Suez Canal shares, Baron Lionel de Rothschild advanced £4 million overnight to the British government. A transaction so swift and secret that Parliament wasn't informed until after the fact. Such feats made the Rothschilds the wealthiest family of the age. They were granted noble titles across Europe, barons in England and Austria, entering high society, yet they preferred to operate in the background. A saying emerged: "The Rothschilds have all the money in the world." Caricatures in the press showed them as puppet masters manipulating events from behind the curtains of diplomacy. The reality was a bit less nefarious. They exerted influence not by plots, but by the sheer weight of capital and information. When central banks ran out of gold or countries teetered on default, the Rothschilds often stepped in to stabilize the system at a profit. In 1825, for example, the Bank of England nearly collapsed. Nathan Rothschild's gold shipments saved it. During the Austro-Prussian War, the Rothschilds floated loans to the defeated side, Austria, to ensure stability, even as they financed the victors' railways. Their strategy of lending to governments and even to both sides in conflicts meant they almost never lost. Peace or war, they collected interest. By the late 19th century, Rothschild influence was at its peak. But across the Atlantic, new financial titans were rising, forged in the industrial boom of the Gilded Age. The age of aristocratic European financiers would soon meet the age of brash American capitalists, and the torch of financial dominance would pass once again. United States, late 19th century. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Railroads crisscross the land, factories churn, and one resource powers it all: oil. In this new world, a devout bookkeeper turned entrepreneur named John D. Rockefeller would build an empire to rival any old-world dynasty, becoming the richest man of the modern era. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870 and methodically crushed his competition. By 1900, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of the U.S. oil refining industry, an unprecedented monopoly. He famously remarked, or at least is reputed to have said, "Competition is a sin," and he acted accordingly. His tactics were unsparing. Rockefeller struck secret deals with railroads to get rebates, cashback, on oil shipments, ensuring his costs were far lower than competitors. He'd then slash prices in their markets, operating at a loss until the rivals either sold out to him or went bankrupt. One by one, refineries fell under Standard Oil's control. By the 1880s, Standard Oil wasn't just a company. It was a shadow government. It dictated pipeline rates, influenced legislators, and dominated the economy. The public grew wary. Political cartoons showed Standard Oil as a monstrous octopus, wrapping its tentacles around Congress and even the White House. Rockefeller, meanwhile, stayed out of the spotlight, running his empire with almost obsessive secrecy and discipline. Rockefeller's wealth soared to levels never seen before. In 1913, after over 40 years in business, he became the world's first confirmed billionaire. His net worth around $900 million, then nearly 3% of US GDP at the time. At one point, his fortune accounted for about 1 out of every $50 in the American economy. It's the equivalent of over $300 billion today, making him arguably the richest private individual in history up to that point. Such dominance could not stand unchallenged. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed Standard Oil's tactics, and public sentiment turned anti-monopoly. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Standard Oil an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken into 34 smaller companies. It was a dramatic dismantling of an empire. Ironically, the breakup made Rockefeller even richer. He retained shares in all the newly formed companies, and many of those stocks soared in value. Observers noted that Standard Oil's dissolution increased Rockefeller's fortune, as the sum of the parts outgrew the former whole. Rockefeller himself joked that the government's intervention had been the best thing to happen to his investments. Having conquered the oil world, Rockefeller channeled his energies into philanthropy. effectively turning his attention to shaping society. He established the Rockefeller Foundation, 1913, and poured hundreds of millions in old dollars into medicine, education, and science. He founded the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University, transformed public health by funding campaigns that helped eradicate hookworm and yellow fever, and revolutionized medical education. This philanthropy was certainly altruistic, but it also extended Rockefeller's influence in a new guise. By funding institutions, he quietly guided the direction of research and public policy. Some critics at the time muttered that Dr. Rockefeller was prescribing how society should evolve. Yet many of the beneficiaries saw it as enlightened giving. John D. Rockefeller's life, rising from nothing, monopolizing a vital industry, then rebranding as a benevolent patriarch, set the template for the 20th century tycoon. But he wasn't the only American titan of his time. Where Rockefeller commanded oil and industry, another man, J.P. Morgan, commanded the realm of banking and finance, wielding power as an empire builder of money itself. Around the same era, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, reigned as America's unofficial central banker. If Rockefeller was the oil king, Morgan was the king of finance, the titan who could make or break markets with a nod. Where others built fortunes, Morgan built the machinery that underpins fortunes: corporations, trusts, and banks. J.P. Morgan and Company wasn't just a bank. By 1900, it was an octopus of its own sort, entwined in railroads, steel, electrical companies, insurance, you name it. Morgan had a singular talent: consolidation. He would take fierce business rivals and force them into alliances under his guidance, creating giant trusts that tamed chaotic markets. In 1901, Morgan orchestrated the creation of U.S. Steel by buying out Andrew Carnegie's steel company and merging it with others, forming the world's first billion-dollar corporation. When asked the price Carnegie demanded to sell, Morgan reportedly waved it off. "If it is reasonable, I'll pay it." Money was a tool for Morgan, not an end. Control was the end. Morgan's influence extended to the very financial stability of the nation. 1895. The U.S. Treasury was on the verge of running out of gold. A panic from the 1893 crash had drained reserves to dangerous lows. The U.S. government itself was teetering toward default on its gold standard obligations. J.P. Morgan stepped in as a one-man lender of last resort. In a secret meeting with President Cleveland, Morgan and the Rothschilds, as his overseas partners, agreed to supply the U.S. Treasury with 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for U.S. bonds. Morgan had even found a loophole in an old law to make this deal without Congress's approval. In effect, Morgan acted like America's central bank, because at that time, one didn't exist. The 1895 gold bailout saved the U.S. financial system, but it also confirmed something unsettling: that a private banker now held more sway over U.S. finances than the U.S. government itself. Critics howled, populists thundered about the money power, but the deed was done. Morgan was hailed in elite circles as a savior. One newspaper quipped that only the Almighty had saved the nation, and J.P. Morgan was his agent. The pattern repeated dramatically in 1907, with an event that cemented Morgan's legend. In October 1907, a panic struck Wall Street. A cascade of bank runs and trust company failures threatened to bring down the entire economy. There was no Federal Reserve, only the desperate pleas of bankers to the one man they believed could stop the collapse: J.P. Morgan. Morgan summoned New York's top bankers to his mansion. Night after night, they met under his stern gaze, debating how to shore up weak institutions. One night, as 120 bankers gathered in Morgan's library, debate stalled. No one wanted to sacrifice their own funds to save a failing trust. At 3 a.m., Morgan grew tired of the bickering. He quietly locked the doors and put the key in his pocket. "Gentlemen," he said, as the story goes, "we are not leaving until we agree to a plan." Through sheer force of will, Morgan compelled them to commit $25 million to backstop the failing banks and trusts. By dawn, he had a deal in hand. The bankers, arm twisted, signed pledges to jointly rescue the troubled institutions. The panic of 1907 subsided. Morgan's intervention had stopped the financial contagion, but the nation had witnessed a startling spectacle: the entire U.S. economy rescued by one man's command. Cartoonists depicted Morgan as the Colossus of Wall Street, bestriding the New York Stock Exchange. Progressives were alarmed. Even President Theodore Roosevelt, no friend of monopolists, had to admit Morgan's actions likely saved the day. The 1907 panic was the final straw that led America to say, "We need a central bank, and fast." Congress, shocked by the crisis, formed commissions to study banking reform. One famous remark came from Paul Warburg, a banker who warned in 1907 that America's financial system was at about the same point as Europe in the time of the Medicis, essentially archaic and vulnerable. The solution: a modern central bank. In 1910, a secret conference of bankers and senators on Jekyll Island, including Morgan's proxies, drafted the plans for the Federal Reserve. By 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was law, creating the central bank that could issue currency and provide liquidity, tasks that had often fallen to Morgan's syndicates in crises. The era of one-man bailouts was over, and institutional lenders of last resort had arrived. Tellingly, J.P. Morgan died in 1913, just a few months before the Fed opened its doors. It was as if an age of personal financial titans was seeding to a new age of systems and institutions. When Morgan died, he left a fortune far smaller than Rockefeller's. But his power had never been just about his own wealth. It was about his control over others' capital. A joke circulated. Morgan's assets died with him. Rockefeller's assets kept generating money. Morgan's bank, eventually J.P. Morgan and Company, lived on and continued to be a pillar of global finance, later evolving into today's J.P. Morgan Chase. But the age of individual financial overlords was giving way. No single banker would again have quite Morgan's unilateral power, at least not openly. Yet, as we'll see, the imprint of these dynasties remained. They had set in motion structures and norms that ensured finance would stay the nervous system of power. Legacy, the enduring shadow of the financial dynasties. From the Medici in their Florentine palazzo to Morgan in his Manhattan library, these families and figures shaped the financial world we inherited. They pioneered techniques to gain power, some innovative, some ruthless. And their legacies echo today. Banking practices we take for granted began with them. International currency exchange, Medici bills of exchange, diversified holdings and early limited liability franchises, Medici branch system, corporate monopolies, Rockefeller's trusts, and too-big-to-fail interventions, Morgan's rescues. Even the creation of the Federal Reserve was, in part, a response to the immense power bankers like Morgan wielded. Their stories also carry a caution that financial innovation and ambition can drive progress, but unchecked greed and power can sow instability. The Medici Bank fell due to bad bets and overreach. The Fuggers faced popular backlash and the limits of one man's lifespan. The Rothschilds, while enduring, saw national governments eventually take on roles they once filled. Rockefeller's monopoly was broken by public demand. Morgan's dominance led to the creation of a central bank to curtail any single hand's influence. Each time society reacted, sometimes too late, sometimes in time, to rein in the power of the money kings. And yet, the game continues. Booms and busts still happen. New fortunes rise, tech moguls, hedge fund managers, oligarchs, and with them, new centers of power. They may not carry old family names, or perhaps their names are Bezos, or Musk, or Diamond, etc., but they operate on principles little changed from the playbooks of old. Leverage information, master new technology or markets, outmaneuver rivals, influence policymakers, and sometimes, when crisis strikes, emerge even stronger. In every age, wealth finds a way to power. What changes are the rules, and how openly it's exercised. The Medici and Fugger operated in a world where banks were mystical and new. Rothschild in a world of empires and secret cables. Rockefeller and Morgan in an era of industrial might and minimal regulation. Today we have laws, watchdogs, and media scrutiny, yet massive financial power still often works in the shadows, only occasionally spotlighted during turmoil. So, what can we learn from these hidden emperors of money? They remind us that behind the visible structures of government and economy, there is often an invisible architecture of finance. Understanding it is key to understanding why events happen as they do. When we see a market crash or a nation in debt, the reflex is to look at presidents and parliaments. But history teaches us to also look at the money trail, the creditors, the quiet meetings in back rooms. The stories of the Medici, Fugger, Rothschild, Rockefeller, Morgan and their ilk are a saga of human ambition, of leveraging intangible trust credit to wield very tangible influence. They operated sometimes benevolently, sometimes selfishly, often ruthlessly. They toppled as often as they triumphed, but collectively, they built the financial world stage on which today's drama plays out. As long as there are vast sums of money to be made, there will be those who seek to become the next Medici or Rothschild. The power behind the throne, or with no throne at all, just power. It's a caution and a call to awareness. Follow the money, because often, the hands that hold the wealth are the hands that quietly shape the world. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more.